This is the Farming for a Better Climate podcast. Hello and welcome to this Farming for a Better Climate podcast. My name is Séamus Murphy and I'm joined again by Robert Ramsay. How are you doing, Robert?
Hi, Séamus. Yeah, very good. All fine here. How are you?
Not too bad now at all. So we've spent the last few podcasts looking at how kind of the unique shocks that we felt in 2022, kind of 23, have impacted agriculture in Scotland and the different sectors. Today we're going to be looking at sheep. What would be kind of the unique elements of all of this in terms of sheep that you could kind of highlight for us?
Yeah, so I suppose the sheep sector in Scotland is massive and it covers all land types. So we've got probably the most diverse sector, if that's, I think I'm right in saying that, as we've got sheep right on some of the best ground we've got in arable rotations and on real good intensive systems near the sea, and then we've also got obviously the extreme hills and everything in between. So it's hard to summarise how the sheep sector has been impacted by the various crises that we've had. Obviously, the intensive sheep system is actually not far off what the inputs that the dairy guys have struggled with. So obviously, fertilizer and fuel are have been significant, but I think probably there's a fair chunk of the sheep sector that's probably cruised through reasonably well. Now, that's not to say that people haven't felt it, because there's been everybody's been under pressure, but compared to some of the other more intensive sectors, I think sheep's probably done pretty well over the last year.
Look at that, we have Jennifer Struthers here from the SAC Consultant Lanark office to try and kind of shine some light on what farmers on the ground, or sheep farmers on the ground, have been experiencing. Welcome to the podcast, Jennifer.
Hi, Séamus.
So we kind of, I suppose, we could start with we've experienced a bit of an energy crisis. The war in Ukraine is just over a year old now, and that has caused multiple issues, just as we were coming out of kind of the supply chain issues that were caused by COVID. What has been the kind of experience of the day-to-day farmer, sheep farmer, then dealing with all these kind of global issues?
Yeah, I think what Robert said is probably true enough, that the sheep have probably been least impacted. It's so wide and varied in what we're dealing with day to day and who we're speaking to. I cover the Lanarkshire area, and we go all the way from top of the hill, extensive blackies, to quite a high proportion of really intensive pedigree Texel breeders, that kind of thing. So, and everything in between. So, I think overall, probably people would feel quite okay that their sheep enterprise hasn't maybe been as affected. But as we're moving into lambing, this might be the first time that they've really seen it, because last year lambing time, the feed was bought okay. It wasn't that we were just, the war in Ukraine was just sort of hitting as lambing time, so a lot of the feed would already be bought, so that would be bought cheap. So it's probably just now that we might actually be starting to see people going out to buy sheep feeding for lambing time, and see that real impact to the higher feed costs. Fertilizer on a farm scale has been a big issue, but again, people probably don't associate that with their sheep. They'll probably blame that on their cattle a bit more, because although the sheep will be taking some of that silage ground and some of that grazing ground, but it's probably, the sheep are probably being okay just now, but we see the prices are going back, and as I say, the feeding, they're only just getting into that period where the feeding might become the big concern.
The other thing, this time of year we're always looking. I was speaking to my vet today, and he was asking me when I start lambing, and I said 1st of April, and he said, it's 3 weeks. And you think, oh, right, okay, this is coming. But what we got last year was a really, really good spring. Things went well, and grass grew really well, really early, and actually even that later feed, as feed started to rise, we were pretty much done feeding sheep anyway. So we had the wind was in our sails probably right through from there would be a lot of lambs born that didn't see a lot of rain in their whole life. They performed
Yeah,
well and were off farm. And we're just probably heading into that, the great unknown, as we do every spring, is what kind of spring are we going to get? When are we going to be stopping feeding sheep? How much are we going to have to put into them? And how do we keep as many alive as possible?
yeah, and I think certainly where I've been, like in terms of the last year, I know bits of Scotland were very varied, but we were very lucky in Lanarkshire with the weather, so we had a great grass growing season. We can totally take a dry summer. So as you say, the lambs didn't have a particularly a lot of rain in their backs, but grass in front of them. Where I know if you go further east, they were struggling because it was too dry. So as I'd say, probably the farmers I'm speaking to day to day, I wouldn't say they're never upbeat. They're from Lanarkshire, but they're generally. I would say they probably haven't felt it as much in their sheep yet as their other enterprises.
Mm. And kind of Robert sort of alluded to it at the start there, but there is that kind of variation between the different systems within sheep. So that kind of that guy who does have hard hill versus the kind of intensive lowland. Do you think there's the risks to each of those systems are quite different then?
Yeah, and I think it's probably it's maybe not the kind of recent. We're talking about war in Ukraine and all the price hikes
Mm,
and stuff. But I think people are probably starting to evaluate their systems a little bit and where they are and what those risks are. And probably coming from a subsidy point of view, but it's all tied together with the climate story as well. And I think there is a lot of people maybe starting to evaluate what they're doing, and a lot of people that should be evaluating what they're doing in terms of their systems, perhaps.
mm,
I think I find it really interesting that probably in the businesses, we've probably got a similar range in land type as you do, Jennifer, but the guys who are most and the guys who are least exposed to any subsidy changes going forward are sheep farmers. So there's really intensive high output sheep systems at low costs that are performing pretty well, and they do make use of a subsidy check, but they probably can make changes to their business to be more resilient and deal with changes to cap or not cap to whatever the replacement is going to be. But then we go to the hill guys, and there's this absolute need, and we need to have an understanding going forward that there's more to what those guys do than just produce lamb, because ultimately they're challenged. The environment that they farm in is very difficult to produce a lot of high quality protein, but what they produce is very good, and all the other public goods they produce need to be recognised.
Yeah, that is very true, and it's probably um, one of the hardest lots of carbon audits to do as well as those hill sheep guys. Maybe the figure at the end of the day doesn't look amazing, but there's very little you can actually tell him to do to reduce his carbon footprint. Because
mm,
normally, in a more intensive system, you say, right, you want more lambs, where are your lamb losses? But you go to these hill systems, they can't deal with more lambs because they don't have the in-by ground. They're restricted by the land type. So you're totally right. The they need to be recognised for the other things that happen there as well. But again, that's where they've probably been they're least affected by the kind of changes in be it energy prices or fuel and fertilizer, because they're not using much of that either.
yeah, so there's a bit of a kind of a almost like a buffer there for those guys, but they're probably limited in what they can do then to kind of reduce with their carbon footprint. We'll say you would hope we're moving towards recognition for the ecosystem services and these kind of things that are provided by hill farmers. I think we are getting closer to that point.
Yeah, I've been doing quite a lot of work up the west coast this year, and it's been great actually doing a wee bit of travelling and things. But the thing that's staring us all right in the face, it really is how good these hill guys are. So they know where they're at. They know there's some real good businesses out there who are under a lot of pressure climatically and environmentally. Um, but really, when we do a carbon audit for them, you realise that they're not actually producing that. The carbon issue for them isn't the main thing. You know, we can go and give them impossible targets to try and meet, to make a tiny chink on the overall agricultural emissions for Scotland. So I think the narrative, the story needs to be different to those guys. We all have a responsibility to do what we can for the carbon scenario. But I mean, a lot of the reasons, go to Oban, for example, and you'll hear a lot of people who are very vocal about the sea eagle. Now, the sea eagle is very much to do with biodiversity. And the best thing I could do for the carbon footprint is to deal with the sea eagle issue. And we can't do that. And I wouldn't promote doing that, or, it's all about balance. And we need to get the balance of the story for these guys right as well.
And it's why there's not going to be one size fits all answer for any of them, because you see the sheep sector is so wide and varied in terms of, and it's a lot to do with the land that you're farming, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's all about these trade-offs, isn't it, between kind of food production, biodiversity, and carbon reduction, essentially, and finding that balance. Is there potentially then for kind of these hill farmers that are producing a product extensively, we'll say, and managing the land in a certain way, and but perhaps not the most efficient use of the land, we'd say. Is there a kind of an opportunity there for that, for these ecosystem services, these kind of other payments to come in and allow that sheep farmer to manage the hill in a different way by maybe reducing stocking rate, stocking density, or these kind of things to the benefit of biodiversity, but then being kind of supported financially in doing so. Do you see that as a future for these kind of, say, more extensive systems?
Historically, that has been, that has always been a thing in part of
Yeah.
agri-environment, stock disposal, getting sheep off. But I think that when that was probably at its height, the stocking rates on those hills will be a lot less than they ever historically were already. And it's probably the balance between somebody feeling like they're farming and somebody feeling like they're just doing it for the payment, maybe. At what point is the critical number of sheep to make you feel like you're actually farming versus just doing it for the money or the payment? Does that make sense? I don't know.
So I think economics has done a lot of what you're talking about there anyway, Séamus. So there are an awful lot of hills, far too many hills for my liking, that are unstocked. And I do wonder whether, to deliver those ecosystem services, we're actually needing to have, I'm not saying more sheep on every hill, because there's certainly plenty of hills that are overstocked, but I think there's big swathes of hill ground across the country that are probably needing sheep back on them, just to give the manager of the sheep a reason to be on the hill and doing all the other stuff they do. And with having, you remove one managed extensive ruminant in a sheep and you replace it with a deer, or something completely unmanaged and unregulated, and we lose all control of the uplands as well.
Yeah, I suppose that's it. It's finding that balance again with producing food from the hill whilst maintaining biodiversity. You using the sheep to help support that whilst producing food. But I take Jennifer's point as well. I understand that a lot of farmers will probably see it as that, as kind of, or may see it as not no longer being a farmer if they're just managing a smaller kind of amount of sheep for the benefit of biodiversity. Really, it's a difficult one. It's a difficult one to find that sweet spot.
I'm just glad I don't have to make all the decisions to come up with what the next scheme's going to be.
Yeah, and I think the thing is, the odd thing about these hills in terms of the carbon story is a lot of these units actually, although that we're saying they've not got an awful lot of scope for reducing, what they can actually do, because they're not going to get to 150% reared, or they're not going to, they're working with what they've got, but the units actually have more scope for other mitigation measures in terms
Mm.
of,
Yeah.
because they've got the scope, they've got the potential for a bit of woodland planting, or they've probably got peatlands that might become more important. So I think it's about finding the balance between what they can do and what they want to do, as well, rather than just saying sheep are, the sheep need to go to make this good, because that's not really the case either. As you say, there's plenty of
Yeah.
scenarios where there's hills that would absolutely benefit from sheep being back on them, so that they are managed in some sort of way.
And we've got this new, focus on resources, and probably I think the human race has realised that we can't just consume everything, and if we do that, it's a finite process. So, but what we have in the hill sheep system, and to an extent the overall sheep system, is somewhere we can produce real good quality human grade protein from nothing. It's from a resource that has limited use elsewhere. And these extensive systems, we shouldn't be, we've been critical of them here as a potential for making improvements because of the challenges they face, but we need to be positive and empower these people to kick on and continue doing what they're doing, because they've got a hugely important part to play in
Yeah.
feeding a growing population.
Yeah. Yeah, I do also, I think it's important as well to, there are different options where that will need to be looked at in the future as well, potentially for kind of these extensive hill sheep farmers, whether that's eh, different kind of management systems that will encourage biodiversity, or encourage, or as you kind of pointed to there, was, planting trees, or even agroforestry systems, or these kind of things that could possibly bring about the multiple benefits whilst also producing food.
I think we're down to something like 600 grams per head of the British population. 600 grams of lamb per head per
Not
year.
surprised. Mm.
It's
Yeah.
mental.
Okay, so we've kind of covered we've touched on that um, the extensive system, and kind of, although they may not have been directly impacted by the kind of recent energy crisis, or the global shocks that we've all experienced, there's still quite a bit that those farmers will be concerned about, or will be thinking about, will be considering going forward in as we move through 2023. If we move now to those kind of more intensive sheep guys in the lower ground, um, and you kind of mentioned that there'll be a lot of feed involved there, you know.
Yeah, it kind of comes back to what do we actually mean by upland or intensive, or where are we
Mm,
actually drawing the lines? Because I see an extensive hill is easy to imagine, and you can say, well, very much low input, but then I think there's intensive because they're trying to be really intensive, and that might be real hard rotational grazing systems, or really intensive indoor lambing systems. But I think there's a lot of people make their sheep work intensive, but it's not really an intensive system. It's just a system. It's just sheep, but they're making it more intensive than it should be. And I think probably that's the bit in the middle that probably has the most room for improvement, maybe.
okay.
Does that make sense?
If you look at the guys who've done, the low cost grass based, real super duper rotational grazing guys, most of them have gone organic because they don't need nitrogen fertilizer, because they can grow grass they've got their grasses up to a point, and they've got their grazing systems so under control that they can grow the grass they need without synthetic fertilizer. So, and they also, because now they've gone organic, not all of them, there's just a handful of them have, but by going organic, they've then been forced to reduce their feed input as well, and probably eliminate their feed input because of cost. And they've created a system where, just by their own management, they've created a very low input system, which is a high output system. And for me, that's the sweet spot when it comes to these kind of upland type farms, is how can we get loads of stuff off farm without bringing much stuff on farm. And grass, I think grass, a predominantly sheep system with a few cattle involved in it as as lawnmowers effectively, is probably really well placed for that high output, low input system.
I think there's people out there who are really pushing for efficiencies and have been for a while now, and they probably are going more down that grass-based system. But I would say there's also some pretty intensive guys who will be doing pretty early lambing stuff, try to get the early lamb market as well. And it's hard to then start to compare and contrast between who's got it right or who's got it wrong. And I don't think anybody does, but it's where the efficiencies could be made. And I think there's a lot of people that probably have sheep and are very much, we've always had sheep and this is what we've always done, and we've always fed them with a snacker, or we've always brought them in before lambing and fed them hard, and I think it's those guys that are probably now, when they've phoned the feed rep to get their usual 10 or 20 ton of Euros, probably, their jaw would maybe hit the floor a bit when they started to think about that. And I think it's those systems who have probably been, those upland systems probably, who are just the same as they've always been, that probably that'll feel it most and have probably the most room for efficiency savings as well.
It's certainly the group, when we are carbon auditing, that there's probably the most time and the most interest in, or for me it's the most interesting group that we've actually, there's lots and lots in that kind of, the business you're describing there, Jennifer. There's lots of stuff to get your teeth into. There is lots of room for improvement, and the sheep system has been quite lucky in that the methane story, the climate change story, has been very much focused on beef, while the methane story from the sheep sector is still a thing, and we do have a job of work to do there. I think the traditional guy is the one that's probably the one that there's an awful lot of change required, or potential for change in their business to make the sustainability story better and also make them more money.
Yeah, and that's always the really interesting part when we get to the end of a carbon audit and we have that conversation, is that I think a lot of people have got a bad impression of what a carbon audit is going to be, and there's a lot of eye rolling and why am I needing to do this? But actually, when you get to the end, you say anything that's going to save you carbon is probably going to save you money or make you more money. It's what you're trying to do in your business. Get as much off farm with like least inputs. That's what the aim of the game. And I think you're right. It's the really interesting conversation, and I think there is definitely a lot to be done in a lot of sheep systems.
The one that's quite current, I think, is, so looking at, we've lost Spectam and lost all the options for watery mouth treatments, and we've lost we've not lost it, but the price of iodine's gone through the roof, and the price of, so the stuff that we need to do a traditional shed lambing system is disappearing, or has, it's been a real challenge to get. We then have to go back to like core principles of good sheep nutrition, colostrum quality, and then also, as you said, Jennifer, the system. So do we really need to lamb? So we need people lambing at various times throughout the year or throughout the spring to get a level profile of lamb. Otherwise, we create a glut, an even bigger glut in August, October, November time. But there's a wild number of people lambing sheep at the end of February and starting selling lambs in August. And we can do this better and easier, and taking pressure off people, because I think that's the other thing is staff is impossible to get across all sectors. And when it comes to hired help for lambing, it's harder to get someone. So it's with less people on the ground, less intervention options, we have to start looking at these systems and asking, it's not to say don't do it, but we've just got to ask for all systems, why do we do it this way?
Mm.
Yeah. And I think the exciting bit about sheep, I think, in terms of that conversation at the end of a carbon audit of what they can do is it's actually really quick to make changes in a sheep system.
Yeah.
If you're looking at a cattle system that you're trying to tighten calvings or change breed policy, you're looking at such a long journey to get there, because you've got such a long time before it can have a calf, and then before that calf becomes a heifer, whereas actually you can turn a sheep system round to something completely different really quickly.
Mm.
And I think you can, people who've done it, I think it was John Vipond, I say this quite a lot, is, I think the breed easy care obviously got a lot of probably bad press because it just didn't look like anything we'd ever seen before. And I think people confuse the breed easy care with the phrase, something should be easy care. John Vipond, I'm sure it was, anything can be easy care. You just need to cull hard enough. If it looks at you the wrong way, if it's causing you time or costing you money, get
Mm.
rid of it. And I think there are people certainly doing that to great effect, but I think people could do that more, especially as you say when it comes to labour, because if you're having to lift its feet, or you're having to intervene at lambing or sook lambs, that is all time, and if you don't have the person there, you know you should you should have your sheep working for you rather than
Mm-hmm.
you working for your sheep
And
almost.
it also kind of comes back to the, we've got the stratified system and we celebrate that, and we should celebrate it because it's an amazing use of land, hill used cascading down into right down into the low ground. But we also have, that culling story is really easy when you breed your own replacements. And it's actually really hard when you've spent 180 quid on a mule gimmer that actually doesn't cut the mustard. So you've bought 100 and 5 of them aren't very good. It's quite hard to make a decision to cull those out the system in year one.
Yeah.
So again, it's a question as to, should we all breed our own replacements? I don't think we should, but I think everyone could, and everyone should have that thought process, have that conversation to see if, is there a different way of doing what we're doing. And to be fair, for some people, that might mean stop breeding their own replacements and start buying mule gimmers. There's lots of options, but just make sure that what you want to do and what you are doing are actually aligned.
I think just to bring it back as well to kind of the bit that about the carbon audits, when you mentioned the beef systems have maybe taken most of the flack, and you've kind of got your sheep systems there sitting in the background, working away, getting very little. Well, maybe sheep farmers might disagree with me, but less flack anyway than beef. But it is definitely going to come at some stage in the near future, because as retailers, as processors begin to look down their supply chains and into kind of where the emissions are coming from. At the moment, yeah, they're seeing number one is beef, but running a close second in terms of where emissions are coming from, and for a food retailer is going to be sheep. So when these kind of companies start to get put these kind of programs in place to try and reduce their emissions across their beef systems, you can be guaranteed that the focus will then shift to sheep. There's not that much lamb being eaten in the UK, so that could come from an international retailer. These kind of things, all of that stuff, all these kind of emissions reduction targets that supermarkets and companies have set out, it's all going to start to feed back into to what's happening on the ground.
And that's where again, like it almost flips on its head a little bit, because we see, the extensive guys have got the least they can really change maybe to their actual system. But if it comes to a whole farm carbon thing, they've got the most scope to say, well, we can go and plant 10 hectares of trees and actually suddenly make our farm a lot better and more attractive to the retailer. And it fits in with the more romantic image of a blackie lamb or whatever off a hill. But the guys we're probably talking about there with the more traditional systems, they're probably working on limited acres as it is. So they don't have that option of, being able to plant. So they're kind of double whammy if they're being inefficient, and they don't have the same options for mitigations in terms of tree planting or sequestration, tree planting, or they're not going to have a peat bog or whatever. So those guys are the ones that really probably, should be thinking that, as you say, that this is coming down the line, and how can we actually start to implement it now? And as I say, sheep are quite quick, so if they took it really serious today, they might actually make some serious progress before, the microscope does fall on
I
sheep.
think most of the people we are dealing with are on that journey anyway. That I think to say that they're not looking at it at all is not quite right. They know it's coming, and they're mostly quite interested, and most of them have. So I mean, we've beef and sheep at home, but I always think about, I don't have a sheep system and a beef system. I've got a beef and sheep system welded together, so I can't work my beef system without my sheep, and I can't work my sheep without my beef.
And that's again true, again back to your very first question about, how are sheep performing with or how are sheep farmers coping with the shocks that we've had. And if you ask them how their sheep are performing, they would probably say fine, but it's because it's their whole system. Overall they would tell you that price of feed's horrendous, price of fertilizer, price of fuel's through the roof, but it's to do with their whole farm, and a lot of those things then fall to the cattle side. And that's why we've probably had a bit of negativity, certainly at the start of all this, that it was, the cattle were going to really suffer. But there's a bit of, as you say, it's so intertwined that it's really hard to separate out what is cattle and what is sheep. And then sometimes it falls down just to whether the farmer prefers the cattle or whether he prefers the sheep as to what his outlook will be on it.
The real challenge with these, natural systems is we want everyone to get super efficient, which is great, and I want to get all of my clients to be as efficient as they can be, but at the moment, all or the vast 99% of lambs are born in the spring months. We have a problem if we become super efficient, and if we all, the brilliant efficient system would be lambed on the 1st of April, lambs doing 400 grams a day and away by the time the Highland Show comes round. But we have a system where there are lambs slaughtered every week of the year, and there's a need to slaughter lambs every week of the year. So we almost need an inbuilt inefficiency in the system, and we need that in cattle and across all sectors as well. So there's an element of as far as the industry goes, retailers want to know carbon footprints and things. That's all good, but we also need to think about the profile of what we're producing, and how do we be that super efficient business or super efficient sector that has really good environmental credentials, and also supply what the general public need, which is fresh lamb 52 weeks of the year.
Because probably the processors would say that that's a bit of kind of what's happened in cattle, because when there was more efficiency push in cattle, more people moved to spring calving, and I'm sure processors would tell you that they would like a few more autumn calving herds probably to because they do come, there's times of the year where the cattle are more scarce, and it probably is to do with a bit of a more push to spring calving, because you can probably make more efficiencies in that system. So you're totally right. If everybody started lambing in April and had these super efficient sheep, we would all be, the price would reflect that as well at that time.
And then we become a net exporter, like a massive exporter for a couple of months, and then a massive importer for the rest of the time. It doesn't make sense. So, but no, the sheep system, the sheep world shouldn't fear climate change targets. I think we've got and something that's achievable. I think we've got options on the table and good positive things we can do for businesses to get the whole sector across the line here and be involved in something really good.
Okay, I think that's a good place to wrap up. Thanks very much, Robert and Jennifer, for joining us.
Thanks for having us, Séamus.
Yeah, thanks, Seamus. Cheers.
Bother. For more information on what was discussed in this podcast, please visit the Farming for a Better Climate website. More of the episodes in the series of podcasts can be found on the Farming for a Better Climate website or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.